The unwelcome stairs. The Taylor family's move into the quiet suburban neighborhood had been a long-anticipated event for Charles and Sarah Taylor. After years of service in the military, Charles wanted nothing more than to provide his family with a stable, peaceful environment where their children, James, 10, and Emily, 8, could grow up free from fear or uncertainty. Their new home, a charming two-story house with a white picket fence and a neatly manicured lawn, seemed to be the perfect place for their fresh start. Charles had carefully chosen this neighborhood for its reputation as a family-friendly, welcoming community, the kind of place where the American dream thrived. For Sarah, the house represented more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of the life they had worked so hard to build together. The kids were already dreaming about treehouses and lemonade stands, and for the first time in years, they felt hopeful about their future. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. A watchful eye. From the moment the moving truck pulled up to the Taylor residence, Mrs. Benson, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, had been watching. Her house sat directly across the street, its lace curtains a constant veil over her sharp eyes. Mrs. Benson had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 4 decades, priding herself on its stability and order. She considered herself the unofficial gatekeeper of their little corner of suburbia, someone who ensured that everything stayed as it had always been. When she first saw the Taylors step out of their car, Mrs. Benson's lips thinned into a line of disapproval. Charles's broad shoulders and upright posture immediately marked him as a man of discipline and authority. Sarah's warm smile and confident stride spoke volumes about her inner strength. Their children ran up the driveway, their laughter echoing through the quiet street. It wasn't their demeanor that Mrs. Benson objected to, it was their difference. She wasn't used to seeing a black family in her neighborhood, and the mere thought unsettled her. She muttered to herself as she watched Charles greet the movers with a firm handshake. "I hope they don't bring trouble," she whispered, pulling the curtain tightly shut. The barbecue invitation. A week later, the Taylors decided to host a small barbecue in their backyard to introduce themselves to the neighborhood. Charles and Sarah had always believed in fostering community bonds, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to get to know their new neighbors. Sarah had spent the entire morning preparing a menu of classic backyard favorites: juicy burgers, freshly baked rolls, and her signature potato salad. Charles manned the grill with his military precision, ensuring everything was cooked to perfection. As the smell of sizzling burgers wafted through the neighborhood, a few curious neighbors began to stop by. The Taylors greeted each guest with genuine warmth, offering plates of food and engaging in friendly conversation. James and Emily ran around the yard, laughing as they played tag with the kids from next door. Charles noticed Mrs. Benson peeking out from behind her curtains and waved at her with a welcoming smile. She quickly disappeared from view. Sarah, noticing his gesture, nudged him. "Give her time," she said softly. "Not everyone adjusts to change as quickly as we'd like." Charles sighed but nodded. "I just want her to see we're here to contribute, not disrupt." Mrs. Benson's resentment. Across the street, Mrs. Benson paced her living room, glancing occasionally at the joyful scene unfolding in the Taylors' backyard. The laughter, the music, the casual camaraderie. It all felt too foreign, too intrusive. In her mind, the neighborhood had always been a sanctuary of quiet and routine. The arrival of the Taylors threatened that delicate balance. She couldn't pinpoint why their presence bothered her so much. Perhaps it was the sense of change they brought, the way they seemed to radiate confidence in a way that made her feel small and out of place in her own home. Perhaps it was the discomfort of confronting her own prejudices, something she had always justified as protecting the neighborhood. As the evening wore on and the sounds of the barbecue continued, Mrs. Benson's frustration grew. She picked up her phone and stared at it, her mind racing. She felt the urge to act, to do something, anything, that would reassert her sense of control. Finally, she dialed 911. The call. 911. "What's your emergency?" the operator asked. Mrs. Benson hesitated for a moment, then said, "There's a disturbance in my neighborhood. A large group of people is making noise and causing a scene. It seems suspicious. The operator asked for more details, but Mrs. Benson kept her descriptions vague. She avoided outright lies but framed the gathering in a way that made it sound unruly and threatening. By the time she hung up, her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a mixture of guilt and justification. She told herself she was doing the right thing, maintaining the neighborhood's peace. The police arrival. Back at the barbecue, the Taylors were enjoying a moment of calm. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard as the guests lingered, chatting and laughing. Charles had just poured himself a glass of lemonade when the sound of approaching sirens shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Everyone turned to see two police cruisers pulling up in front of the Taylors' house. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they scanned the yard. Charles instinctively stepped forward, his military training kicking in as he positioned himself between the officers and his family. "Good evening, officers," he said calmly. "How can I help you?" One of the officers, a young man with a clipboard, cleared his throat. "We received a report of a disturbance in the area. Can you tell us what's going on here?" Charles gestured to the yard. "We're having a barbecue with a few neighbors. Nothing out of the ordinary." The officer looked around, noting the relaxed atmosphere and the friendly interactions between the guests. It was clear there was no disturbance to speak of. The second officer, an older man with a more seasoned demeanor, stepped forward. "It looks like everything's in order here," he said, his tone softer. "Sorry for the interruption, sir. We'll just file this as a misunderstanding." As the officers turned to leave, Charles couldn't help but glance across the street. Through the lace curtains, he saw the faint outline of Mrs. Benson watching. A family's resolve. After the police left, the mood at the barbecue shifted. The guests tried to resume their conversations, but the incident had cast a shadow over the evening. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Charles's arm. "We can't let this get to us," she said softly. "We've faced worse before." Charles nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, but it's not just about us. It's about showing our kids and this neighborhood that we belong here." Little did they know, the events of that evening were just the beginning. The next day would bring unexpected allies and a powerful message that would ripple through the neighborhood, challenging the very fabric of prejudice and fear. Unveiling prejudice. The morning after the barbecue, the Taylor family tried to return to their routine. Charles rose early as usual, his military background keeping him disciplined, and went out for his morning run. The air was cool, the streets quiet, but there was a tension lingering in the atmosphere. Last night's unwarranted police visit had left a sour taste in his mouth, though he hadn't wanted to alarm his children. Sarah, however, had felt the weight of it. She spent the morning preparing breakfast and chatting with James and Emily about their plans for the day. She wanted to shield them from the undercurrent of unease she sensed but couldn't shake the memory of the flashing lights outside their home. The neighborhood's reactions. As Charles jogged through the neighborhood, he noticed subtle changes in how people behaved. Neighbors who had waved enthusiastically during the barbecue now avoided eye contact or turned away as he passed. A man walking his dog crossed the street abruptly, his face unreadable. It was as though the police visit had validated some unspoken doubt in their minds, even though it had been a baseless call. By the time Charles returned home, he was drenched in sweat, not from exertion, but from the simmering frustration he felt. He found Sarah in the kitchen, her brow furrowed as she sipped her coffee. "Did you notice anything strange this morning?" he asked, toweling off. Sarah hesitated. The Thompsons canceled the playdate with Emily and their daughter. They said something about being busy, but it felt off. Charles sighed, his jaw tightening. "It's starting already. One call, one assumption, and suddenly we're under suspicion." Mrs. Benson's justification. Across the street, Mrs. Benson sat in her living room, sipping tea and recounting the previous night's events to her close friend on the phone. "I just couldn't ignore it," she said, her voice carrying a mix of indignation and self-righteousness. All that noise, the unfamiliar people coming and going, it didn't feel right. I had to do something. Her friend was silent for a moment before replying. But didn't the police say everything was fine? Maybe you overreacted. Mrs. Benson bristled. I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. They don't belong here. And I'll do what I have to do to make sure they don't disrupt things. She hung up the phone, her resolve hardening. In her mind, she was protecting her home, her way of life. The idea that her actions could be rooted in prejudice was something she refused to entertain. An unexpected visitor. Later that morning, as Sarah watered the flowers in the front yard, a car pulled into the driveway. It was sleek and black, with government plates. Sarah tilted her head, puzzled, as a sharply dressed man stepped out, adjusting his tie. He carried an air of authority, his every movement deliberate. "Mrs. Taylor?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes," Sarah replied cautiously. "How can I help you?" "I'm Agent Marcus Grant," he said, extending his hand. "I work for a civil rights organization. We received word about what happened last night." Sarah blinked in surprise. "I don't understand. How did you find out?" Agent Grant offered a small smile. "Let's just say you have powerful friends who care about what's happening here. May I come inside? I'd like to discuss this further." The gathering storm. Inside the house, Charles joined Sarah and Agent Grant at the dining table. Grant explained that a friend of Charles from his military days had learned about the incident through mutual contacts. Concerned about the implications, the friend had reached out to the organization, knowing they had the resources and influence to intervene. "This isn't just about last night," Grant said, his tone serious. "This kind of behavior, calling the police over nothing, isolating you from the community, it's a pattern we've seen before, and it can escalate if it's not addressed." Charles nodded, his expression grim. "We've faced prejudice before, but I didn't expect it here. We just wanted a fresh start." "And you deserve one," Grant replied. "That's why we're here. We're mobilizing a team to support you. Lawyers, community organizers, even local media if necessary. This isn't just about defending your rights. It's about making sure this neighborhood understands that you're here to stay." The family's resolve. After Grant left, Charles and Sarah sat in the living room, processing everything he had said. It was overwhelming to think that their move to a quiet neighborhood had become a battleground for something much larger. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with worry. "We stand firm," Charles said, his voice steady. "We don't let fear or prejudice push us out of our home. If they want to challenge us, we'll show them who we are, not just with words, but with actions." That afternoon, they sat down with James and Emily to explain what had happened. They kept the conversation age-appropriate, focusing on the importance of standing up for what was right. "Sometimes people don't understand us because we're different," Charles said gently. "But that doesn't mean we don't belong. It just means we have to show them how strong and kind we are." James nodded solemnly, while Emily crawled into Sarah's lap, her small arms wrapping tightly around her mother. "We're a team," she said softly. "Right, Daddy?" Charles smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's right, sweetheart. We're a team." Allies begin to arrive. The next morning, the Taylors woke to an unexpected sight. Cars began arriving in the neighborhood, one after another, parking along the street near their home. Out stepped a diverse group of people, lawyers in suits, community activists holding clipboards, and even a few reporters with cameras slung over their shoulders. Agent Grant was among them, coordinating the group with practiced efficiency. The neighbors, including Mrs. Benson, peeked out from their windows, their curiosity piqued and their nerves on edge. They watched as the group gathered on the Taylors' lawn, greeting Charles and Sarah warmly and discussing their next steps. Mrs. Benson's stomach churned as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood being forced to confront its biases, And for the first time, Mrs. Benson began to feel the weight of her actions. A message of unity. Agent Grant addressed the group, his voice carrying across the lawn. "We're here today to stand with the Taylor family, to show this community that prejudice and discrimination have no place here. Together, we can ensure that every family feels safe and welcome, regardless of their background." Charles stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the gathered allies and the curious neighbors watching from their windows. "We moved here because we believed in the promise of this neighborhood, a place where families could thrive together. That promise doesn't come from the houses or the lawns. It comes from the people, and we're ready to do our part to make it better." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time since their move, the Taylors felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they knew they weren't facing it alone. The allies assembled. The day after the unexpected gathering on the Taylors' lawn, Charles sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, flipping through a stack of papers that Agent Marcus Grant had provided. These documents detailed the rights every homeowner had, especially in cases involving racial discrimination. It was a sobering reminder that the very systems meant to protect people could also be weaponized against them. Sarah brewed coffee, her movements deliberate and measured. "Do you think this will change anything?" she asked, placing a mug in front of Charles. "I mean, having all these allies show up. It felt powerful, but will it actually shift the mindset of this neighborhood?" Charles looked up from the papers, his face lined with determination. "If nothing else, it shows them we're not alone. And sometimes that's enough to make people think twice." Just as they were settling into their morning routine, the doorbell rang. When Charles opened the door, he was met with a familiar face, General Howard Davis, a former military colleague and close friend. Behind him stood two other men, both dressed sharply in business attire. "Howard," Charles said, his face breaking into a rare smile. "What are you doing here?" Howard stepped inside, clapping Charles on the shoulder. "When I heard about what happened, I couldn't just sit by. These gentlemen are lawyers from a civil rights organization I've worked with before. They're here to help. Strategizing for change." Howard and the lawyers sat with the Taylors at the dining table, their voices low but resolute. They discussed strategies for addressing the systemic issues that had led to the previous night's incident. The lawyers explained how they could use local anti-discrimination laws to hold people accountable and ensure the neighborhood association enforced inclusive policies. One of the lawyers, a tall man named Derek, leaned forward. "We're not just talking about defending your family. This is about creating a precedent, making it clear that these actions won't be tolerated." Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I want to believe in the good of people, but it's hard when you've seen the worst of them. How do we convince our neighbors that we're not here to disrupt anything, that we're just like them?" Derek smiled gently. "Sometimes, the best way to show people who you are is to keep being yourself. The right people will come around. The others, well, that's what we're here for." The community reacts. While the Taylors were inside planning their next steps, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Benson, unable to keep her growing unease to herself, invited a few of her closest neighbors over for coffee. The small group gathered in her pristine living room, their whispered conversations charged with tension. "I just don't understand why they needed to bring all those people here," one woman said, stirring sugar into her tea. "This is a quiet neighborhood. We don't need outsiders stirring things up." Mrs. Benson nodded vigorously. "Exactly. I've lived here for decades, and this kind of thing has never happened before. They're making a spectacle out of nothing." But not everyone in the room agreed. One man, a soft-spoken retiree named Mr. Jenkins, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mrs. Benson, maybe we're the ones who need to change. If their presence makes us uncomfortable, isn't that on us? They haven't done anything wrong." The room fell silent, Mrs. Benson's face hardening. "It's not about being uncomfortable," she snapped. "It's about maintaining the peace." Mr. Jenkins sighed but said nothing further. He could see that Mrs. Benson wasn't ready to listen. James and Emily's experience. Meanwhile, James and Emily were facing their own challenges. At school, word of the police visit had spread quickly. Some kids whispered behind their backs, while others avoided them altogether. James, who was usually outgoing and quick to make friends, found himself eating lunch alone for the first time. During recess, a group of boys approached James on the playground. "Hey," one of them said, smirking. "Did your dad call all those people to come scare the neighbors?" James clenched his fists but kept his voice steady. "No, they came because they care about what's right." The boys laughed. "Yeah, right. You don't belong here, and neither does your family." Before James could respond, a girl from his class stepped in. Her name was Mia, and she was one of the few students who hadn't avoided him. "Leave him alone," she said, glaring at the boys. "You're just scared because his family stands up for themselves." The boys muttered something under their breath before walking away. James looked at Mia, his gratitude evident. "Thanks," he said quietly. Mia shrugged. "My mom says people who act like that are just insecure. Don't let them get to you." The neighborhood meeting. That evening, the neighborhood association called an emergency meeting to address the growing tension. The Taylors attended, along with their allies, including General Davis and the lawyers. The community center was packed, the air thick with unease as neighbors shuffled in, avoiding eye contact with the Taylors. Mrs. Benson was the first to speak. She stood at the front of the room, her posture rigid as she addressed the crowd. "This neighborhood has always been a peaceful place," she began, her voice sharp. "But recent events have disrupted that peace. We need to ask ourselves if this is the kind of community we want to be." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Before Mrs. Benson could continue, Charles stood up. His imposing presence commanded attention, and the room fell silent. "With all due respect, Mrs. Benson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "my family isn't here to disrupt anything. We're here because we believe in this neighborhood. Its potential to be a place where everyone feels welcome and safe." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But feeling safe isn't just about what's outside our doors. It's about what's inside our hearts. If my family's presence makes you uneasy, maybe it's time to ask why." A powerful ally speaks. General Davis stepped forward next, his uniform lending him an air of undeniable authority. "I've served this country for decades," he said, his voice resonant. "I fought alongside men and women of all backgrounds, united by a common goal. The strength of a community isn't in its sameness. It's in its ability to embrace diversity." He gestured toward the Taylors. "Charles Taylor is a man of honor. He's sacrificed for this country, just like many of you. And now he's asking for nothing more than the same respect and opportunity you'd want for your own families." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on the crowd. Even Mrs. Benson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. A shift in the air. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Some neighbors approached the Taylors, offering quiet apologies or tentative smiles. Mr. Jenkins shook Charles's hand, his voice earnest as he said, "I'm glad you're here. This neighborhood needs more people like you." As the Taylors walked home that night, Charles paused, looking at his son. "I don't know, James, but what I do know is that we're not going to let anyone make us feel like we don't belong. This is our home, and we'll make it better by being here." An unexpected letter. One morning, as Sarah collected the mail, she noticed a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Dear Taylor family, I want to apologize for the way some of us have treated you. It's not right, and it's not fair. Please know that not everyone in this neighborhood feels the same way. I hope we can find a way to move forward together. A neighbor." Sarah read the note aloud to Charles over breakfast, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you think it's genuine?" she asked. Charles nodded. "It's a start. Whoever wrote this is trying to do the right thing." Emily looked up from her cereal. "Does this mean we have a friend, Mommy?" Sarah smiled softly. "It means we're not alone, sweetie. The Allies take action." Meanwhile, Agent Grant and the team of civil rights advocates were working behind the scenes to ensure the Taylors' rights were protected. They had started a community awareness campaign, distributing flyers and organizing workshops about the importance of diversity and inclusion. One weekend, they hosted a neighborhood barbecue at the local park, inviting all the residents. The event featured games for the kids, music, and plenty of food. The goal was simple: to create a space where people could connect as neighbors, free from prejudice or assumptions. The Taylors attended, hesitant at first, but soon finding themselves surrounded by support. Malia and her family greeted them warmly, and even Mr. Jenkins brought over a plate of homemade cookies. As Charles mingled with the crowd, he noticed Mrs. Benson standing at a distance, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. He considered approaching her, but decided to give her space. Change couldn't be forced. It had to come from within. A public stand. That evening, the Taylors were invited to speak at the barbecue. Charles stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When my family moved here, we did so because we believed in the promise of this neighborhood," he began. "We believed it could be a place where our children could grow up safe and happy, where we could build a future together." He paused, scanning the crowd. But belief alone isn't enough. It takes action, courage, and understanding to make a community thrive. We're not perfect, and neither is this neighborhood, but we have the power to make it better, together. The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Charles felt a sense of hope. Even if not everyone in the neighborhood was ready to embrace change, there were enough people willing to stand with them. Mrs. Benson's reflection. Back at her house, Mrs. Benson watched the barbecue from her window. She could hear the laughter and see the mingling of neighbors, a scene that should have brought her comfort, but instead filled her with unease. She didn't understand why she felt this way, why the sight of people coming together made her feel so isolated. For the first time, Mrs. Benson began to question her own beliefs. Was she protecting the neighborhood, or was she holding it back? The note that Sarah had received had been written by her, a small but sincere attempt to make amends. But she wasn't ready to face the Taylors, not yet. As the sounds of the barbecue faded into the night, Mrs. Benson sat alone in her living room, grappling with the realization that perhaps the change she feared wasn't as frightening as she had imagined. The Taylors' resolve strengthens. Back at home, the Taylors sat together in the living room, reflecting on the day's events. James and Emily were full of excitement, recounting the games they had played and the new friends they had made. For the first time in weeks, the tension in the house seemed to lift. Charles looked around at his family, his heart swelling with pride. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "No matter what, we'll stand together." Sarah squeezed his hand, her smile radiant. "And we're not alone." Today proved that. Little did they know, the next chapter in their journey would bring even greater challenges and greater triumphs. The turning point. The Taylors woke up the morning after the neighborhood barbecue with a renewed sense of hope. The outpouring of support from the event had strengthened their resolve to build a life in this neighborhood, despite the lingering resistance from some residents. Yet the next steps weren't entirely clear. Change had begun, but the deeper roots of prejudice would not disappear overnight. While Charles read the morning paper at the kitchen table, a knock sounded at the door. Sarah answered it to find Mia's mother, Karen, standing on the porch, holding a basket of freshly baked muffins. Karen smiled warmly. "I just wanted to officially welcome you to the neighborhood," she said. "And thank you for speaking at the barbecue. It meant a lot to me and my family." Sarah invited Karen in, and over coffee, the two women talked about their hopes for the neighborhood. Karen shared her frustration, with the silent complicity of some residents who refused to challenge Mrs. Benson's behavior. "It's not enough to just avoid being part of the problem," Karen said. "We need to be part of the solution." A ripple effect. Karen wasn't the only neighbor to reach out. Over the next few days, Other families came by to introduce themselves, offering words of encouragement or small gestures of kindness. James and Emily, who had initially struggled to make friends, found themselves invited to playdates and after-school activities. Even Mr. Jenkins, the quiet retiree, took it upon himself to write a letter to the neighborhood association, urging them to adopt more inclusive policies. "This isn't just about the Taylors," he wrote. "It's about the kind of community we want to be, a place where everyone feels welcome and valued." But not everyone was ready to embrace this new spirit of unity. Mrs. Benson, feeling increasingly isolated, began to escalate her campaign against the Taylors. She whispered to anyone who would listen that the family was stirring up trouble and that their powerful friends were a threat to the neighborhood's way of life. Mrs. Benson's tactics. One afternoon, as Sarah walked Emily home from school, she noticed Mrs. Benson standing on her front porch, glaring at them. Sarah offered a polite wave, but Mrs. Benson turned away, muttering to herself. Later that evening, Charles received an email from the neighborhood association informing him that Mrs. Benson had filed a formal complaint against their family. The complaint accused the Taylors of violating neighborhood peace and decorum with their recent gathering of allies and accused them of disrupting the harmony of the community. Charles read the email aloud to Sarah, his voice laced with frustration. "This isn't about harmony," he said. "It's about control. She's trying to push us out." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Let's respond with facts and integrity. We've done nothing wrong, and we have the support of our allies." Building a defense. Agent Marcus Grant and the civil rights lawyers quickly stepped in to address Mrs. Benson's complaint. They gathered evidence, including video footage from the barbecue and testimonies from supportive neighbors, to demonstrate that the Taylors had done nothing to violate community guidelines. At the same time, they launched an initiative to educate the neighborhood about the harmful impact of systemic racism and implicit bias. They distributed pamphlets, hosted workshops, and invited guest speakers to share their experiences. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Mia's mother, Karen, became one of the most vocal advocates for the Taylors. She organized a petition demanding that the neighborhood association formally condemn discriminatory behavior and implement measures to promote inclusion. Within days, the petition had garnered dozens of signatures. A confrontation. One sunny afternoon, as Charles worked on the treehouse in the backyard, Mrs. Benson appeared at the edge of the fence. Her expression was a mix of anger and desperation. "Mr. Taylor," she called out, "I'd like a word." Charles climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Benson?" he asked, keeping his tone calm and measured. Mrs. Benson crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "I don't appreciate the way you've brought outsiders into our neighborhood. This is supposed to be a place for families, not political agendas." Charles met her gaze steadily. "Mrs. Benson, my family moved here for the same reason as anyone else, to build a better life. We're not here to stir up trouble, but we won't stand by and let prejudice go unchallenged. If that feels like a threat to you, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." Mrs. Benson opened her mouth to respond but seemed to falter. For the first time, Charles saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked away. A powerful ally arrives. The next day brought an unexpected visitor, Judge Margaret Green, a prominent figure in the local justice system and a longtime advocate for civil rights. She had heard about the Taylors' situation through Agent Grant and decided to pay them a visit. The meeting begins. As evening fell, the community center filled with a mix of curious neighbors, staunch supporters, and a handful of skeptics, including Mrs. Benson and her closest allies. The tension was palpable, the room buzzing with whispers and sideways glances. At the front of the room, the neighborhood association board members sat stiffly, their expressions a blend of discomfort and anticipation. Charles and Sarah entered with their children, flanked by their allies. The room quieted as they took their seats, and all eyes turned to the association president, Mr. Whittaker, who tapped the microphone to signal the start of the meeting. "We've called this meeting to address recent events that have caused division in our community," Mr. Whittaker began. "The goal tonight is to hear from all sides and work toward a resolution that upholds the values of our neighborhood." The accusations. Mrs. Benson was the first to speak. She stood at the podium, her posture rigid and her tone defensive. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, she began, "and I've always believed in maintaining peace and order. But in recent weeks, that peace has been disrupted." She glanced pointedly at the Taylors. "It's not about race," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "It's about the way certain people have brought unnecessary attention and conflict to our community. We've always been a quiet, respectful neighborhood, and I fear that's being threatened." Murmurs rippled through the audience, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged skeptical glances. Charles and Sarah remained composed, their hands clasped tightly under the table. The Taylors speak. When it was Charles's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his presence commanding the room. He walked to the podium and took a moment to survey the crowd, meeting as many eyes as he could. "With all due respect to Mrs. Benson," he began, his voice steady, "peace and order are not achieved by excluding or marginalizing others. My family moved here because we believed in the promise of this neighborhood, a promise of safety, opportunity, and community. But from the moment we arrived, we've been met with suspicion and hostility." He held up a copy of the anonymous threatening letter they had received. "This was left in our mailbox. This isn't peace. This is fear, and it's unacceptable." Charles's words hung in the air, the room silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. He then gestured to his son. "My son, James, has something he'd like to say." James approached the podium, his small hands clutching his handwritten letter. His voice trembled at first, but as he read, it grew stronger. "We just want to be friends with our neighbors," he said. "We want to play outside without feeling like we don't belong. My dad always says that being different is what makes us special, but sometimes it feels like people don't see that. I hope one day they will." By the time James finished, several audience members had tears in their eyes, including Karen and Mr. Jenkins. Judge Green's intervention. Next, Judge Green took the podium, her authoritative presence filling the room. "I've worked in this community for decades," she began, "and I've seen how fear and prejudice can destroy neighborhoods from the inside out. But I've also seen the incredible things that can happen when people choose courage over comfort." She turned to the association board. "The Taylors have done nothing but try to be good neighbors. The responsibility now falls on this community to show that it values inclusion, fairness, and decency." Judge Green's words were met with applause, though Mrs. Benson and her allies remained stone-faced. A moment of truth. As the meeting continued, more neighbors began to speak up in support of the Taylors. Karen shared how her daughter, Mia, had defended James at school. Mr. Jenkins recounted his own journey toward understanding and acceptance. Even a few previously silent residents stood to express their regret for not speaking out sooner. Finally, Mr. Whittaker addressed the room. "It's clear that this neighborhood is at a crossroads," he said. "We can choose to let fear divide us, or we can come together to build a stronger, more inclusive community. The choice is ours." He then proposed a vote on adopting a new set of neighborhood policies that explicitly condemned discrimination and promoted inclusion. The proposal was met with overwhelming support, and even some of Mrs. Benson's allies reluctantly raised their hands. Mrs. Benson's turning point. As the meeting adjourned and the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Benson remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions, not just the harm they had caused the Taylors, but the division they had sown in the community she claimed to love. She watched as Charles and Sarah spoke with their supporters, their faces alight with hope and determination. Slowly, hesitantly, she stood and made her way over to them. "Mr. Taylor," she said quietly, her voice wavering, I want to apologize. I was wrong." Charles looked at her, his expression softening. "Thank you, Mrs. Benson," he said. "It's never too late to choose a different path." A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The Taylors' presence became a source of pride for many residents, a symbol of the community's growth and resilience. The new policies enacted by the Neighborhood Association set a precedent for other communities, and the story of the Taylors' perseverance was shared widely, inspiring others to stand up against prejudice. One sunny afternoon, as Charles and Sarah watched their children play in the newly built treehouse, they felt a profound sense of peace. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, not just as a family, but as part of a community that had learned the value of standing together. And across the street, Mrs. Benson stood on her porch, watching the children laugh and play. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope for the future, a future where everyone truly belonged.